It's a problem as old as time, but exacerbated by many orders of magnitude in the current information age. Arguing is frustrating, rarely productive, and gets exponentially worse as you add more stakeholders. Arguing is so often such an unpleasant and futile activity that few would blame you if you opted out altogether, given the chance. Arguments we do choose tend to be cast as debates to be won or lost, rarely the opportunity they could be to gain a greater clarity and understanding. And yet, there is just no substitute. The shortest distance between disagreement and mutual understanding is to just have the argument, if you can navigate it. Find a way to avoid the obstacles and distractions, and arguing would be a pretty powerful thing. Most solutions for navigating arguments actually sidestep them altogether to skip ahead to some form of resolution. But bypassing conflict before there is true understanding gained only postpones the conflict. The radical idea behind ArguAtlas is that instead of doing everything we can to avoid arguments, we should be putting our energy into finding ways to make them better. First, we need to expose individual information bubbles, gain a perspective into how each other really feels so we stop speculating, especially when it comes to our opposition. We need a neutral battlefield for arguments to play themselves out on, with simple, straightforward rules that offer neither side advantage and keep the attention focused where it should be. We need to give people the opportunity to engage on their own terms. That means making the content of dialogue durable so it can be revisited as needed. Leave the choice of arguments to explore and win to each person to the extent they choose, and on their own timeline. Finally, we need more voices to be a benefit, not a distraction. More opinions should mean we get exposed to the best and most diverse set of ideas possible. We must capture that. We do these things, and arguments would become informative, healing, and most of all, productive. ArguAtlas accomplishes all of this by building a map. It records and contextualizes every argument, each point in its most clear form, girded by the best arguments related to it. If you aim to meticulously catalog the entire universe of arguments, you first have to get at them. And you get at them by getting inside the bubbles. By offering frustrated interests a more productive framework to conduct arguments, ArguAtlas attempts to funnel as much dialogue onto its platform as possible, where it can there be tracked and measured. The more dialogue funneled onto the platform, the more useful and attractive of a tool it becomes. As disparate bubbles build out unique worldviews on the same platform, a major clash begins to brew. But again, this should be welcomed. On ArguAtlas, there is no fear of being taken out of context, because you control the context yourself. Every position you take is traceable back to core foundations, and the ramifications can be followed to every logical conclusion. Manipulation and obfuscation common to most dialogue has no foothold on ArguAtlas. So if you really believe what you believe, this is the best shot you have to make your case. Both the advocates and opponents of any given point can crowdsource refinements, honing their arguments to their sharpest state, and then they smash together. Now, unlike political collisions, though, this is unlikely to play out as a fantastically violent explosion, quickly settling into equilibrium. The relationships between the argument subparticles will reveal themselves slowly and methodically as advocates react to the reactions of our opposition, shaping each other's arguments' orbits. Even if slow-moving and dynamic, a picture will no less emerge that offers clues to how ideas relate and their true relevance in the system. Inconsistencies in circular logic and other fallacies will be exposed. Preconceived notions replaced with accurate insights. The true crux of our conflicts revealed along with the most informed positions one might take. From there, finally, meaningful and productive dialogue might be possible. Now let's talk about how the hell we actually do it. The trick is to define rules that make arguing process trackable and measurable without limiting expression while still keeping distractions in check. Here's how. Start with a neutral site. Dialogue on ArguAtlas is conducted on a form of wiki. For a conceptual framework, imagine a very basic node and link system. Each node on ArguAtlas is a single component argument within a larger system. That larger system represents a complete narrative, rationale, or perspective being mapped. The process of defining your own position on ArguAtlas allows you to shape arguments and counterarguments one by one to build out what becomes a very expansive dialogue. Any arguments you accept are continuously refined into their very best form by both your own effort and the effort of dozens, thousands, or millions of people who also accept the same points. Your combined effort also establish which other arguments should be linked to it. And they can be linked in one of three ways. First way is as an argument that should precede it to support it. Often they are the premises or conditions that need to be accepted before we would accept the argument at hand. Arguments that are associated this way are the because arguments. Next are the arguments that follow, the corollaries or conclusions you might draw if you were to accept this argument. These are the so arguments. Finally, there are the arguments opponents want to highlight to discredit it. Arguments that, if you accept, mean you likely will reject this argument altogether, the rebuttals. So much of the frustration in arguing comes from the opposition, in a sense, having free rein to meddle with the form your arguments take and the associations you make between them. The manipulation obfuscation rampant in arguments is sometimes purposeful, a tactic some use for advantage, but often it is completely innocent, a mere unintentional byproduct of attempting to understand someone else's perspective through the lens of your own bubble. ArguAtlas provides a much-needed visual reference to aid in following each other's thinking, which we otherwise are terrible at. Its representation is kept fair by limiting which side can shape which parts of the map. As such, the only people shaping how a perspective is presented should be the people that accept it, and the only people who should have any ability to offer counter-arguments are the people that reject it. So the ground rules are simple. Accept the argument, and you have the right to cast a single vote both for how the argument is best stated, what tone and added nuance is appropriate, and a single vote for a link to an explication. This is simply any article, video, podcast, or any other type of content you believe tells the best story to clarify the argument. You also get the ability to cast a distributed and weighted vote for what other arguments should be linked to this argument with a because or so relationship. This way, important arguments get promoted, while lesser arguments are diminished, but without ever losing the fact that the link exists, even if weak. Weighting your vote for how an argument links to because and so arguments is truly essential to this process. It allows the advocates of the argument a way to control how links are prioritized, with far greater nuance than basic stack ranking. This gives your opposition and potential fellow advocates precise context of how important certain arguments actually are to your position. If you reject the argument, you are only given the right to a distributed and weighted vote for the rebuttals. Not only does this allow you to bring greater focus to the very best rebuttals, but it also diminishes any straw men our advocates would prefer to focus on to make the opposition seem less credible. It's a fundamentally simple structure, but not yet a familiar one. A brief demo should help with this concept. Let's say you're on Facebook and join a good primal scream into the void. You post one of your trademark rants. This time it's thoughtless outburst about vegetarians. But here your friend Carl has posted a reply. Carl is that guy who is always first to post a Snopes article to debunk your post when it wasn't all that well researched. This time, recognizing that your screams into the void are really just attempts to connect and be heard, made in vain, he replies with a post to ArguAtlas that he hopes will soothe you. Let's see where it goes. We are taken to an argument very similar, if less inflammatory, than your own. This is the standard ArguAtlas mobile interface. The black area in the center contains the argument and at the very top of this section is a unique identifier and a place to toggle through different cohorts. Tags are down at the bottom. In the main body, you have the most popular phrasing of the argument according to the cohort. And in the explication link to whatever it believes to be the best content, article, video, clip, study, whatever, to drive the point home. Finally, you have the option to either accept or reject this argument, the first step to adding your own unique voice to the Before we accept this argument that we are clearly favoring from the get-go, we are going to do a little due diligence to confirm to ourselves that we are right as we think we are. You can swipe down to view the arguments in the because, but let's start with a swipe right to take us to the rebuttals. Here we have all the arguments to reject, ordered by the weight collectively given by the opposition in this cohort. If you want to see the full list and the weights given to each, there is a link at the bottom. Just the arguments with the most statistically significant weighting are displayed initially. We don't see much here to pique further interest, though, so let's move on. We still are leaning towards accept, but let's check the because. Swipe. Here we see the vast majority of the cohort that accepts this argument put their weight in the first argument listed, that meat was essential to our evolution. But for us, this is a little surprising. We always heard that our canines were the clearest sign of our meat-eating birthright. It is on the list, but why only 2% weight? We would have thought this would have gotten a lot more. So let's follow that one to learn more. That takes us to a new argument page. The same interface, this time for the teeth argument. Now let's check its rebuttals. Alright, let's see what they have to say. Oh. Looks like these are actually pretty good reasons to reject. Huh. I guess canines meaning meat eater may have just been a myth. To double check that there aren't any massively compelling reasons to accept that are just as good as the reasons to reject, swipe down on the because section. Well, that seems true, but that does nothing to support our teeth actually telling us anything about our diet. Swipe back. I think we gotta reject this argument. Oh yeah, big time. Hardly anyone in this cohort thinks this anymore. See, once I accept or reject an argument, you see what percentage of the cohort also accepts or rejects the argument. And I also have new privileges as someone who has taken a position. I can add my own weight to the rebuttals that I think most clearly delegitimize it. But let's leave this weak argument alone for now and see if we can find some surer footing. Back on the meat being natural argument, we see why 70% of the other advocates put their weight on the first argument, that meat was essential to our evolution. We could follow that argument as well to verify as we did before, but let's just keep moving. We're going to go ahead and accept this. Again, we have taken a position, so we now have access to new abilities to shape the argument. Unlike before, we accept this argument, so our interests are aligned largely with other advocates that want to see this argument be as strong as possible. That's why we now have access to that edit button down at the bottom right corner of the black square. There we can cast a vote for the very best phrasing of this argument from among its many variations, to bring forth the most concise, the most unimpeachable, or what one might call the mot juste. We also have a vote for the very best explication link. But for now, let's skip the pedantry and see what follows in the so of our newly accepted argument. Now this is interesting. The argument I was expecting to see is at the top, but it is followed very closely behind by two others that take things just a bit further. The first argument listed assumes this to be a black or white proposition, either for meat or against meat. But the next two open the conversation around whether we should accept the status quo of our current consumption rates or if they should be reduced. I'm going to investigate my initial instinct just to see if there's anything obvious that makes ending the argument here less satisfying than expected. We are now on that argument's page. Let's check out the rebuttals. Okay, let's see what they got. Our biology doesn't define us. Seems fair. Our consumption is greater than it should be. I suppose that would be compelling, if true. Killing animals is wrong. And probably missing the mark with this audience. Fourth, see, I always hear it as healthier, but what about my mental health? Does that play into that part of the question? I don't know. This last one, though. Meat production is harmful to the environment. You see, we are deeply concerned about climate change and our impact on the environment, but never heard of meat production playing a role in this issue. Let's check that out. I want to see what case to be made there is to be made here, so I'm going to jump right into the explication link this time. So we take a few minutes to read the article, and we are converts. After reading the evidence presented in the article, we are shocked to learn how damaging meat production is, and a little embarrassed we were so unaware. We may not be fully ready to give up meat, maybe it's just too delicious and our willpower sucks, but we definitely see the need to make a change. Any good rebuttals at all? No. So let's accept this. Now back to the argument I came from. We now reject that. Now let's exercise our right to weigh in on rebuttals. Click on the newly accessible Weigh In button at the bottom. When you weigh in, you can scroll through the whole list of arguments ordered by the cohort's weighting, but now we have the chance to weight it the way we feel makes the most sense to us. If an argument you want to make is not currently associated, you can add new, but all the arguments we need are already here. Let's get more eyes on this ecological disaster under our noses. From our perspective, most of these arguments pale in comparison to this newly discovered ecological issue, so I'm going to give that the bulk of our weighting, saving a little for the first argument because we think that was still a pretty good point too. And submit. And look at that. Our heavy weighting of the ecological argument was enough to bump it up the list of this larger cohort we belong to. More weight should increase its visibility and credibility, improving the likelihood that others will recognize its importance as well. Now, if I wanted, I could always review my personal weighting by changing the cohort view to just me. This is how we can return to this perspective whenever we want, in case it needs to be adjusted. Who knows, maybe after more exploration we'll come around on the ethics of killing animals also. Let's get back to the main cohort and keep shaping. Now back to the main view. And back to the argument. We still accept this, but we have some different thinking around what it means. So let's weigh in on the so's. Click the bottom. We no longer think you should stop at just being okay with meat in your diet. Even if you like meat, you should recognize the value in reducing consumption. So we give all our weight to the second argument. And luckily enough, once again, our backing for reduction was enough to now make our preferred argument rank first in this cohort. Let's pause there. Consider what we accomplished in the course of just 10 minutes, including the 2 minutes to read that outside explication article. We were exposed to over 20 unique arguments. We helped shape the dialogue by taking a position on 3 of them and redistributing some weight of the associations between more than 10. Not to mention the fact that we learned enough for our thinking to evolve and for us to be more confident in our adjusted position. This is just a hypothetical, but imagine what would happen if we scaled this up. Say the average ArguAtlas user spent an hour on the platform over the course of a week. Now imagine just 10,000 users. In just a week, those 10,000 people could collectively be exposed to over 1.5 million arguments. They would take a position on 180,000 of them, and weigh in on over 600,000. Imagine what we would learn as that dialogue out of that takes shape. Even in that short time with a relatively small set of... We are all trapped in these pernicious personal information bubbles. We are bombarded by information constantly, but can only ever make partial sense of it. With no framework to keep track of it, we have to fake it as best we can by developing affinities for certain messages and sources, where we build a hostility toward others, all for reasons more arbitrary than we prefer to accept. Tweets, posts, alerts, email, physical books you can actually check out of the library. These all make up our information bubbles, a nebulous cloud of ideas familiar to each of us but near impossible to compare to others. There is just too much information to juggle, sort, and evaluate on our own, especially without any real tools. No wonder we are so frustrated. With ArguAtlas, though, we give this chaos structure. There is a concept in communications called the Overton Window. Within the window are the range of policies and ideas acceptable in the current climate of public discourse that you or the media or politicians could put forth without appearing too extreme. The Overton window is descriptive of the shape of public discourse in the abstract, but ArguAtlas aims to make it far more That data set that comes out of the documented discourse on ArguAtlas can be used to define the window's shape. Imagine wide acceptance of ideas taking the form of greater depth, creating policy-worthy valleys that cut through soaring mountains of the unthinkable, exposing paths of least resistance to broadly agreed upon destinations. Every contour of the argument landscape lay bare in detail, comparable by equal measure. We do that, and we will get to see if some of the paths reveal themselves to be more widely acceptable than we thought. And maybe a few mountains will show themselves worthy of further exploration. By using ArguAtlas to document your beliefs and challenge opposing ideas in kind, the chaotic cloud of ideas is given measurable shape. What insights might be gained when we see the true form of our common dialogue? In our current state, we are lost at sea in an ocean of valid and invalid ideas. A map is really just the most obvious solution. Now that all the information we could ever want is available at our fingertips, we need to focus on making sense of it. We need to recognize that our future will be void of traditional gatekeepers. The roles normally played by leadership figures or any authority or institution is quickly eroded by competing voices. So to be a little more blunt, the genie of democratized media is out of the bottle. So now we are faced with a choice. As the pace of technological innovation only accelerates, and the need for collective action to solve international issues grows stronger every day, will we keep looking back to old solutions that have adapted poorly and never really worked that well to begin with? Or will we try something new? That's the idea. So kindly explain why this won't work.